Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to guide you through tonight's journey. I know many of you use these videos to help you unwind or drift off to sleep. So before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind relax. It started with sleepless nights, the kind where you lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the world around you grow quieter as the hours drag on. I'd tried everything, reading, watching old TV shows, counting sheep, but nothing worked. My mind would wander, and rest remained elusive. One night, around 2 a.m., I gave up entirely. I threw on my coat, grabbed my keys, and decided to take a walk around the city. The streets were empty, silent, with an eerie sort of calm. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. The city felt different at night, darker, quieter, and somehow more alive. At first, my walks were a relief. The fresh air cleared my mind, and I'd roam aimlessly, letting my thoughts drift. But one night, something changed. I was walking along a narrow street near a line of closed shops. That's when I noticed him, a figure standing at the end of the street, half hidden in shadow. I couldn't see much, but I could tell he was facing me. As I got closer, I realized he was smiling, a wide, unsettling grin that seemed too big for his face. His eyes glinted under the streetlight, following me as I walked past. The smile never wavered, not for a second. I tried to ignore him, brushing it off as just another late-night stranger. But something about that smile stuck with me. It was too intense, almost as if he was waiting for something. The next night I found myself out again, despite the unease lingering from the night before. The city was as empty as usual, quiet and still, but just as I turned a corner, there he was, the same man standing on the same street, smiling that same eerie grin. This time he was closer. His face was clearer under the glow of the streetlight, and I could see that his smile didn't reach his eyes. They were cold, empty, almost hollow, and they seemed to follow me as I walked past. I kept my head down, quickening my pace, hoping he wouldn't follow. But the footsteps echoed behind me, soft but unmistakable. I turned around, but he wasn't there, just the empty street. I could still feel him, though, watching from somewhere close by, hidden in the shadows. Over the next few nights, he was always there, standing somewhere along my path. No matter where I walked or which route I took, he was there, waiting, watching me with that unsettling grin. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, that maybe he was just another insomniac, someone with his own strange habits. But the more I saw him, the more that smile haunted me. It was unnatural, almost like he was wearing a mask that stretched his mouth too wide. The worst part was that he never said a word, never made a sound, just stood there grinning, watching. One night, I'd had enough. I decided to confront him, to ask who he was or what he wanted. I found him standing on a street corner, his shadow stretching long across the sidewalk. Heart pounding, I approached him, forcing myself to hold his gaze. "Why are you following me?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. His smile grew wider, if that was even possible, and he tilted his head slightly, as if amused. "Following you," he replied, his voice soft and cold, like a distant echo. "I've been here all along. It's you who decided to join me." I felt a chill run down my spine. His words made no sense, yet they filled me with a deep, unsettling dread. I took a step back, suddenly desperate to get away from him. He leaned forward, his smile stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth that seemed too sharp, too many. His eyes darkened, his gaze piercing straight through me. "Don't you realize? You're the one who called me." I turned and ran, heart pounding, his soft laughter echoing behind me. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, door locked, lights on. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a trick of the darkness. But his voice lingered, repeating that last sentence like a twisted lullaby. From that night on, things only got worse. I'd see him everywhere, in reflections, in shadows cast by passing cars, even in the brief flash of my phone screen. His grin seemed to follow me, a constant reminder of something lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I stopped leaving my apartment at night, too terrified of encountering him again. But even that wasn't enough. He found ways to reach me. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find my door slightly ajar, or my windows unlocked when I knew I'd closed them. Then, one night, I woke up to find him standing in the corner of my room, smiling that same dreadful smile. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, paralyzed, watching as he took a slow step closer. "Did you think you could escape?" he whispered, his voice barely audible but sharp as ice. "You called me, and now I'm here." I closed my eyes, heart racing, trying to wish him away. But when I opened them again, he was still there, his face inches from mine, that grin stretching impossibly wide. "Sleep," he whispered. "I'll be watching." The last thing I remember before darkness took me was the cold touch of his hand on my shoulder and that endless, haunting smile. When I woke up, he was gone, but the feeling of dread lingered. I haven't slept properly since, always afraid he'll return. Some nights I'll catch a glimpse of him in the shadows, just for a moment, that eerie grin staring back at me. Now, every time I find myself drifting off, I hear his voice echo in my mind. "Sleep. I'll be watching." And that smile, it never leaves me. It started on a Tuesday evening, right after I missed the last bus home. I'd been working late, and by the time I checked the schedule, I realized the next bus wouldn't come for another hour. Frustrated, I decided to walk to the nearest subway station instead, even though it was a bit out of my way. The city was unusually quiet, with hardly anyone else around. The only sound was the faint hum of distant traffic and my own footsteps echoing against the empty buildings. As I walked, I felt the hairs on my neck prickling, that strange sensation of being watched. I brushed it off as nerves and kept walking. A few blocks down, I heard footsteps behind me, faint but unmistakable. I turned around, but there was no one there, just the empty street stretching out in the dim glow of the streetlights. I continued walking, picking up my pace, but the footsteps followed, always just a few paces behind me, never getting closer or farther away. Every time I stopped and turned, they stopped too. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew something, or someone, was there. I finally reached the subway station and rushed down the stairs, relieved to see the platform was empty. The last train was set to arrive in a few minutes. As I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me down here. When the train finally arrived, I quickly boarded and found a seat near the middle of the empty car. The doors closed and we started moving, the gentle rocking of the train lulling me into a strange, uneasy calm. I glanced around. The car was empty, except for a single person seated at the far end. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as the train moved through the tunnel, I noticed something strange. The passenger was sitting perfectly still, too still, staring straight ahead. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could see enough to notice the unsettling stillness, like he was frozen in place. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the flashing lights outside the window as we sped through the tunnels. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I glanced back, and to my horror he had turned his head slightly, just enough to look directly at me. His eyes were empty, hollow, and his face was twisted into a faint, unnatural smile. It was the kind of smile that felt wrong, as if it didn't belong on a human face. I looked away quickly, my heart pounding, but I could feel his gaze fixed on me, unblinking. The train rattled on, and I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe he was just a regular passenger, tired and zoned out. But as we passed through each station, I realized something even stranger. He never moved. Not to get off. Not to change seats. He just sat there, staring at me, with that eerie, frozen expression, When we reached my stop, I practically bolted out of my seat, rushing toward the door without looking back. As I stepped onto the platform, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting him to follow, but the car was empty. The strange passenger had vanished, as if he'd never been there. The doors closed and the train pulled away, leaving me alone on the dimly lit platform. Relieved, I took a deep breath and started toward the exit. But just as I turned the corner, I froze. Standing at the end of the platform, partially obscured in shadow, was the same figure, the silent passenger, smiling that same eerie smile. I blinked and he was gone, leaving me with a hollow, cold fear that seeped into my bones. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, that I was overtired. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that haunting face, those empty eyes staring back at me. Over the next few days, I tried to go about my life, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of someone in the crowd, a shadowy figure with that same disturbing smile. Other times, I'd hear faint footsteps behind me, echoing through the quiet streets, only to find no one there when I turned around. It wasn't long before he appeared again, this time in the window of my bus as I commuted to work. I glanced up, and there he was, sitting in a reflection that seemed to stretch out of nowhere, watching me with that same twisted grin. I looked around, but he wasn't there. Just his reflection, staring back from the glass. And every time I blinked, he was closer, his empty eyes narrowing, his smile growing wider. I couldn't escape him. No matter where I went, he was always there, hiding in reflections, lurking in shadows. Every night I'd hear those footsteps, just a few paces behind, following me through empty streets and silent corridors. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I stopped in the middle of the street and turned to face him, heart pounding. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing into the darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, from the shadows, I heard a faint whisper, barely louder than the wind. "You invited me." I didn't understand. Before I could respond, he stepped into the light, his face inches from mine. His smile stretched impossibly wide, his eyes dark and endless. I stumbled back, heart racing, but he didn't follow. He simply stood there, watching, as if daring me to look away. That was the last time I saw him in the streets, but now, every time I catch my reflection, I see him standing just behind me, his hollow eyes fixed on mine, that twisted smile never fading. And in the silence I hear his voice echoing through my mind, a whisper that follows me wherever I go. "You invited me." Moving into a new apartment in a quiet, older building seemed like a fresh start. I'd just gotten out of a rough patch and was ready to leave everything behind. The place was nothing fancy, but it was clean, affordable, and close to work. Perfect, or so I thought. The first week was fine. Days filled with unpacking and settling in, nights spent peacefully alone. But on the 7th night, at exactly midnight, I heard it. A single knock on my door. I thought maybe it was a neighbor, someone checking in. Though I found it strange for someone to knock that late. When I opened the door, there was no one there, just an empty hallway stretching into darkness. Shrugging it off as a prank, I went back inside. But the next night, it happened again. Midnight, one single knock, and again, nobody there. This time, I felt uneasy, glancing up and down the hallway, waiting to see if anyone was lurking in the shadows. But the silence was thick, and the hallway was empty. By the 3rd night, I was more than a little freaked out. Midnight came, and right on time, there was the knock. I opened the door, quickly, hoping to catch whoever was doing this. But as I swung it open, I felt an odd sensation, an almost electric chill, as if something had just slipped past me and into my apartment. When I looked out into the hall, it was as empty as ever, but something felt off inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, strange noises filled my apartment. Soft whispers from the walls, faint creaking from the floors, and an icy draft that seemed to come from nowhere. I barely slept, my mind racing with fear and confusion. For the next few nights, the knock continued, each time at midnight, always a single, precise knock. I stopped opening the door, too afraid of what I might find, or let in. But even with the door closed, the strange happenings inside my apartment grew worse. Objects would move on their own. A picture frame tilted. My keys shifted to a new spot. Lights flickering when I walked past. And always, that same icy chill hanging in the air, as if something unseen was watching, waiting. I started noticing a smell too, a faint odor of damp earth and decay. It was subtle at first, but it grew stronger each night, filling the rooms, clinging to my clothes, making it hard to breathe. After 2 weeks, I was exhausted, barely holding myself together. The knock had become a dreaded routine, a nightly terror that left me dreading midnight. I considered leaving, moving out, but I couldn't afford it, so instead, I tried to ignore it. One night, determined to get to the bottom of things, I waited by the door, listening, watching. Midnight came, and the knock sounded, sharp and clear. I opened the door, and this time something was there. Standing just outside was a figure, a tall, thin shadow, its features hidden in darkness. Its eyes were hollow, empty, staring right through me. And that smell, that awful stench of decay, flooded my senses. Before I could move or speak, it whispered, a voice so cold it felt like frost on my skin. "You opened the door." The figure took a step toward me, and instinctively I slammed the door shut. Heart pounding, hands shaking. I locked it, backed away, and stumbled into my bedroom, locking that door too. I sat in the dark, holding my breath, listening as the knocking began again, this time louder, echoing through the apartment, a relentless rhythm. The knocking continued all night, echoing from every wall, every surface, until I felt like it was inside my head. When the first light of dawn broke through the window, the sound stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its place. For the next few days I barely left my bedroom, too afraid of what might be waiting outside. But the knocking didn't stop. Every midnight it began again, no longer just at the front door, but at every wall, every surface, as if the entire apartment was coming alive with that dreadful sound. I finally contacted the building manager, desperate for answers. When I asked about previous tenants, he grew quiet, his face pale. He told me that the apartment had been vacant for years. The last tenant, he said, had vanished without a trace, leaving everything behind. No one had seen or heard from them since. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind, just like the tenant before me. Even now in my new apartment, I can't shake the memory. Every night, as midnight approaches, I find myself holding my breath, waiting, hoping I won't hear that single dreadful knock. And some nights when the clock strikes 12, I do. Scrolling through Reddit late at night, I stumbled upon a thread titled, "What's the creepiest thing you've ever experienced?" The replies were a mix of ghost stories, strange encounters, and unsettling coincidences. I'd read through most of the stories, occasionally glancing over my shoulder as each one sent chills down my spine. But one comment stood out. A user claimed they had experienced something bizarre with an old digital camera they found in their grandparents' attic. They explained that whenever they took photos with it, strange faces would appear in the backgrounds. Faces that weren't there when they took the photo. The thread started to haunt me. I couldn't stop thinking about it, even after I closed Reddit and tried to go to sleep. I thought it was just a story, something to scare strangers online, but the thought lingered in my mind. What if it was real? 2 days later, I visited a local thrift store, and as I browsed, I noticed an old digital camera on a dusty shelf. I couldn't explain it, but something drew me to it. The camera was a bit worn, but seemed to be in decent condition. I picked it up, feeling a strange weight in my hands, and decided to buy it. That night I went out for a walk around the neighborhood, bringing the camera with me. I snapped a few pictures of the empty streets, the park, and the distant city skyline. The camera worked fine, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a chill in the air, an unsettling stillness. Back at my apartment, I plugged the camera into my laptop to view the photos. The first few were normal, just pictures of empty streets and trees under streetlights, but as I scrolled through, I noticed something strange. In one of the photos, there was a shadowy figure standing by a lamppost in the distance, something that hadn't been there when I'd taken the shot. It was faint, almost transparent, but it looked like a person, a tall figure with hollow eyes, staring directly at the camera. My stomach twisted. I scrolled to the next photo, and there it was again, a little closer this time. The figure seemed to be moving, each shot bringing it closer and closer, even though I hadn't seen anyone or heard a sound while I was taking them. I deleted the photos, convincing myself it was some kind of glitch, maybe a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure, those empty, staring eyes. I told myself I wouldn't use the camera again, but the next night something compelled me to pick it up once more. I went out again, this time to a different part of town, hoping the change of scenery would make me feel less paranoid. I took a few shots, the city lights glowing in the distance, and then returned home. When I opened the photos, I almost dropped my laptop. The figure was there again, standing in the same spot, staring at the camera. But this time there were others, shadowy faces appearing in the background, each one with a hollow, lifeless expression. It was as if they were trapped in the image, unable to leave. My hands shook as I scrolled through the rest of the photos. In each shot, there were more faces, more figures, filling the background, all staring directly at me with that same eerie gaze. They were close enough now that I could make out details, their clothes, their expressions, each one twisted and grim. I deleted every photo and threw the camera in a drawer, trying to forget about it. But that night, as I lay in bed, I felt the weight of those eyes on me. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, and I felt that familiar chill settle over me. I closed my eyes, hoping sleep would come quickly. Then I heard the faint sound of clicking, like a camera shutter echoing through the room. I sat up, heart pounding, scanning the darkness, but there was no one there. The next morning, I checked my phone, and to my horror, I found dozens of photos I hadn't taken. Each one showed my room from different angles, as if someone had been moving around, snapping pictures while I slept. And in each photo, the same shadowy faces stared back at me, getting closer and closer. I smashed the camera and threw it away, hoping that would be the end of it. But every night I still hear that soft, haunting click, and I know they're watching, waiting, forever trapped in the photos, never truly gone. And sometimes, late at night, I feel them watching from the shadows, their hollow eyes fixed on me, each one closer than the last. It was around 2 a.m., and I was scrolling through Reddit, unable to sleep. I stumbled upon a thread titled, "Have you ever experienced something that couldn't be explained?" Most of the stories were about mysterious sounds, shadowy figures, or odd coincidences. But one story in particular got my attention. The user described a room in their house that always seemed colder than the others, with a door that would lock itself from the inside. They mentioned how sometimes they'd hear faint knocking coming from behind the door, even though no one was inside. The story gave me chills, and I quickly moved on, trying to brush it off. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My apartment felt too quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath. A few nights later, I was talking with my neighbor, an elderly woman who'd lived in the building for decades. I mentioned the strange story I'd read, hoping she'd laugh it off and reassure me. But instead, her face went pale, and she leaned in close. "Be careful," she whispered. "This building has its own secrets. There's a reason that one room at the end of the hall stays empty." I hadn't thought much about that room before. It was the last apartment on the floor, always locked, with a thick layer of dust on the doorknob as if it hadn't been touched in years. Her words lingered in my mind. filling me with a growing sense of unease. One night, I was heading back to my apartment when I noticed the door to that room was slightly ajar. I stopped, staring at the narrow gap, feeling a strange urge to look inside. Before I could think better of it, I found myself stepping closer, heart pounding. Pushing the door open, I was hit by an intense wave of cold air. The room was empty, barely furnished, with peeling wallpaper and an old, musty smell. But as I looked around, I noticed something strange. In the middle of the room was a single, small wooden chair facing the wall, as if someone had been sitting there, watching. I backed out, quickly shutting the door, but as I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint knock coming from the other side. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the room. Every time I walked past, I'd hear faint noises, soft scratching, an occasional creak, like someone was moving inside. One evening, I decided I'd had enough. I went back, determined to find out what was causing the sounds. The door was locked as usual, but I could feel the cold seeping through the wood, chilling me to the bone. I put my ear to the door, listening. For a moment there was silence, then a voice, a soft whispering voice that seemed to come from deep within the room. It was so faint I could barely make out the words, but I could swear it was saying, "Help me, please." I stumbled back, heart racing, but the voice continued, growing louder, more desperate. I ran back to my apartment, locking the door behind me, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. For the next few nights I avoided that end of the hallway, but the knocking followed me. Every night at exactly 3 a.m., I'd hear it, soft, insistent, as if it was right outside my door. I tried earplugs, white noise, anything to drown it out, but nothing worked. One night, desperate for sleep, I finally opened my door, hoping to scare off whatever was making the noise. But the hallway was empty, silent, the light flickering ominously. As I turned to go back inside, I noticed something chilling. The door to the locked room was wide open. I froze, staring at the darkness beyond, and then I saw it, a figure, barely visible in the shadows, sitting in the chair, facing away from me. It was completely still, but I could feel its eyes on me, as if it knew I was there. The door slowly began to close on its own, and before it shut, I heard a faint whisper, "You shouldn't have opened the door." After that night, the knocking stopped. But every so often, as I walk down the hallway, I feel a chill in the air, and the door to that room seems to creak just a little, as if it's waiting for me to return. I moved out a month later, unable to shake the feeling that something was still watching me, still waiting. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still hear that faint, desperate whisper, "Help me, please." I'd always been careful online. You hear enough horror stories about hacked accounts, stolen identities, and mysterious messages, and you get cautious. But last winter, I made one mistake, a single click on a suspicious link, and it changed everything. It was late at night, and I was browsing a forum for tech enthusiasts. Someone posted a link, claiming it led to a hidden chat room for people interested in mystery hacking challenges. My curiosity got the best of me. The moment I clicked, my screen went black, and a message appeared in white text. "Welcome to the game. The rules are simple. Don't try to leave." I tried to close the tab, but nothing worked. The message lingered on my screen, unresponsive to any keyboard commands. Finally, my whole computer restarted, and I thought that would be the end of it. But when my desktop reloaded, there was an icon I hadn't seen before, a small black skull in the bottom corner of the screen. I tried to delete it, but it wouldn't budge. Every time I clicked it, a message popped up with 2 words, "Not yet." I shut my computer down for the night, thinking it was just a glitch or some kind of prank. But the next morning, when I logged back on, the icon was still there. And this time, there was a new message waiting for me. "You have 24 hours to complete the first task. Failure will result in consequences." I felt a chill. It was unsettling, but I was also intrigued. The message included a link to a private chat room, and against my better judgment, I joined. There were a handful of other users in the room, all using aliases just like me. The chat started almost immediately. User Ghost. Welcome to the game. Each day you'll receive a new task. Complete it, and you stay in the game. Fail, and, well, let's not think about that. Me. What happens if we fail? User Ghost. You don't want to know. The first task was simple. Find a specific file hidden on my own computer. I managed to track it down after a few hours of searching. A text file buried in a hidden folder I'd never seen before. It contained nothing but random numbers and letters, but the moment I opened it, a new message popped up on my screen. Task 1 complete. The game continues. For the next few days I received a new task each day. Each one was a little harder than the last. They had me combing through obscure websites, decrypting coded messages, and even logging into abandoned email accounts. Every time I thought about stopping, that skull icon seemed to pulse, as if it was waiting, watching. One night I came home to find my computer already on, with a new message waiting. Task 7, check your inbox. I opened my email, and there it was. A message from an unknown address with no subject line. Inside there was only a single sentence. I know who you are. Attached was a photo. My heart stopped when I opened it. It was a picture of me, taken from outside my apartment window. I closed my blinds, feeling my stomach churn with fear. This was no longer a game. It was something far darker. I typed into the chat room demanding to know who was behind it, but no one answered. The others in the room went silent and the skull icon flickered. The next task was even worse. It led me to a series of coordinates which I hesitantly followed using an online map. The coordinates took me to an empty lot on the edge of town. It was deserted, cold and silent. I didn't go there physically, but something about the exactness of the location disturbed me. I felt like they were trying to lure me into a trap. The final straw came a few days later. My phone started acting strangely, vibrating at odd intervals and then turning itself off. When I finally managed to turn it back on, I found dozens of messages from an unknown number, each one saying the same thing. You can't hide. That night, I heard scratching outside my door, faint, rhythmic, like nails dragging across wood. When I looked through the peephole, there was no one there, just the dark hallway. The next morning, I got the final task. Task 12, log into your bank account. I hesitated, every instinct screaming that this was a terrible idea. But I didn't know what else to do. When I opened my account, I froze. My balance was 0. Every cent had been drained, and in its place was a note in the transaction history. Thanks for playing. I shut my computer down, unplugged it, and spent the next few days trying to rebuild everything I'd lost. I filed a report, changed every password, and deleted everything related to the game. I never returned to that forum and blocked every unknown number on my phone. But every once in a while I get a message with no sender, just a blank text with a single word. Remember. No matter where I go, no matter what I do, it's like they're still watching, still waiting for me to slip up, to make just one more mistake. And the worst part, that skull icon still flickers on my computer screen, waiting, daring me to click. It was supposed to be a simple, quiet weekend getaway, a break from the city, some fresh air, and a chance to recharge. I found a listing online for a charming farmhouse rental just outside a small town. The photos showed an old but cozy house with wide fields, an old barn, and a beautiful view of the surrounding hills. The description was vague, mentioning that it was off the grid and rustic, but that was exactly what I wanted. I booked it without a second thought. When I arrived, the farmhouse was even more remote than I'd expected. The road leading up to it was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and riddled with potholes. The house itself looked a bit more run down than in the pictures, but I chalked it up to old age. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the property, and I could already feel the eerie silence settling in. As I unpacked, I noticed a few odd things. The furniture was dusty, and it looked like no one had been there in years, despite the fact that it was supposedly rented out regularly. The walls were lined with faded photographs of people I didn't recognize. Old family photos, I assumed. But the faces in those photos unsettled me. Their expressions were solemn, almost mournful, and their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. That night, as darkness blanketed the farmhouse, the atmosphere shifted. I heard faint noises coming from outside, like the creak of wood and the rustling of leaves. Figuring it was just the wind, I brushed it off, but the noise continued, growing louder as the hours passed. Finally, I decided to look out the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the dim moonlight, I could see a figure standing in the field, close to the old barn. It was hard to make out any details, but it looked like a man, wearing old-fashioned clothes and standing perfectly still, facing the house. I closed the curtains quickly, my heart racing. It was probably just a farmer or a neighbor, I told myself. Someone who had come to check on the property. But deep down, I knew it didn't feel right. I tried to sleep, but every creak and groan of the old house seemed amplified in the silence. Around midnight, I heard something strange, a faint rhythmic tapping. It was coming from downstairs, like someone was knocking on the front door. I lay frozen, my mind racing. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped, but I could still feel an unsettling presence, like something was lurking just outside. In the morning, I found no sign of anyone at the door. But when I stepped outside, I noticed something strange by the barn. In the dirt, there were footprints, large, boot-shaped prints, leading from the field toward the house. They stopped just short of the front steps, as if someone had been standing there watching. The second night was worse. Around the same time, I heard the tapping again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. I walked downstairs, hoping to catch whoever was playing this sick prank, but when I opened the front door, no one was there. Just the empty field and the dark silhouette of the barn in the distance. When I turned to go back inside, I caught sight of something unusual. One of the family photos on the wall, a picture of a stern-looking man in old farm clothes, looked different. The man's eyes, which had been fixed forward, now seemed to be turned, looking directly at the door. I backed away, feeling a chill creep down my spine. I decided that in the morning, I would leave. But that night, sleep was impossible. The noises grew louder, footsteps, faint whispers, creaking wood, as if something was moving through the house. I lay under the covers, listening, waiting, until I heard a sound that filled me with terror. The unmistakable scrape of footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. Summoning every ounce of courage, I flung the door open, but the hallway was empty. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the stillness of the old house. The next morning, as the first light crept through the windows, I packed my things and left without looking back. Driving down the overgrown road, I felt a sense of relief, but also an unsettling feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. When I got home, I checked the farmhouse listing online, curious about the history of the place, but the listing was gone. The website had no record of it, and there was no trace of the rental page I'd booked through. A few days later, I received an email from an unknown address. There was no subject, no message, just a single attachment, a photo of the farmhouse, with me standing in the doorway, taken from somewhere in the field. And if I looked closely, I could see that figure by the barn, watching. I'd been through a rough year, and a friend recommended I take a break in nature to clear my mind. After some searching, I found an isolated cabin rental on the edge of a dense forest. The listing promised tranquility and solitude, with miles of untouched woods surrounding the cabin. It sounded perfect. When I arrived, the cabin looked older and more worn than I'd expected, but there was something peaceful about it. Just a simple wooden structure with a stone fireplace and a few pieces of rustic furniture. A small path led out into the woods, and I felt the tension of city life melting away. But the first night, strange things began. Around midnight, I was reading by the fire when I heard footsteps outside. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was circling the cabin. I froze, listening intently. After a moment, they stopped, and I cautiously looked out the window. Nothing. Just the stillness of the trees in the moonlight. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer wandering too close. But deep down, I felt a sense of unease, like I was being watched. The next day, I went for a hike to shake off the strange feeling. The forest was dense, with towering trees and thick underbrush. About an hour in, I noticed an odd sight. A small wooden carving of a man, crude and weathered, hanging from a low branch. It looked like it had been there for years, its edges smoothed by wind and rain. The figure gave me an uncomfortable feeling, like it was watching me with its empty, carved eyes. I walked on, but as I moved deeper into the woods, I found more carvings. Each one was a little different. Some were tall, some squat, but all had that same eerie expression, and all seemed to be watching. I hurried back to the cabin, feeling that same strange tension as the night before. That evening, just after sunset, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Looking out the cabin window, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was definitely a person, tall, motionless, facing the cabin. I watched, hoping they would leave, but they stood there, unmoving. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside and call out, the figure was gone, like they'd melted back into the shadows of the forest. The following night was worse. Around 3 a.m., I was woken by a loud thud on the cabin's front door. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and crept to the door, listening. Another thud, louder this time. I was too scared to open it, so I waited, holding my breath. Eventually, the thudding stopped, replaced by a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from right outside the door. I stayed up the rest of the night, too terrified to sleep. At dawn, I decided it was time to leave. I packed quickly, feeling a sense of dread building as I prepared to go. But when I opened the door, I found something waiting on the doorstep. It was one of the wooden carvings from the forest. A small figure with blank, hollow eyes and a twisted expression of horror carved into its face. It was positioned to face the door, as if watching, waiting. I threw it into the woods and hurried to my car, desperate to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, and my heart stopped. Standing at the edge of the forest was the figure from the night before, watching me leave, motionless. When I finally got home, I tried to look up the cabin listing, hoping to report what had happened. But the page was gone, just like it had never existed. I called the rental company, but they had no record of the property. It was as if the cabin had been a phantom, something that vanished as soon as I left. A few weeks later, a small package arrived at my door. There was no return address, no note, just a single item inside. One of those wooden carvings, staring up at me with that same hollow, haunting expression. When my car broke down on a deserted highway late one night, I thought I'd be stranded until morning. The nearest town was miles away, and my phone had no signal. After what felt like hours of waiting, I finally saw headlights in the distance. A battered old truck pulled up, and an elderly man offered me a ride. He looked harmless enough, so I accepted. As we drove, he mentioned a small, quiet motel just a few miles down the road. "The Sunrise Motel," he said with a strange smile. "It's old but decent. It'll give you shelter for the night." I thanked him, and sure enough, we arrived at a low, single-story building with a flickering neon sign. The man gave me a knowing nod as I stepped out, and then he drove away without another word. The lobby was dimly lit, filled with the stale smell of cigarettes and dust. The clerk behind the counter was a woman in her 60s with dark eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. She handed me a key without a word, and I noticed that the tag was labeled Room 6. The room itself was modest, just a bed, a small TV, and a rusty bathroom sink. But something about it felt wrong. The air was thick, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. I shrugged it off as paranoia from the long night and tried to settle in. That's when I heard the first whisper. It was faint, almost like a soft breeze slipping through a crack in the wall. But as I listened, I realized it wasn't random. It was a voice, low and muffled, speaking in hurried, broken words. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to make out what it was saying, but I could only catch fragments. Shouldn't. Not safe. Leave. A shiver ran down my spine, and I backed away from the wall, telling myself it was just an old building creaking in the wind. I tried to sleep, but the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from every direction, filling the small room with faint, urgent pleas. When I finally drifted off, it was only to wake in a cold sweat to the sound of a door slamming down the hall. I stepped out of my room, expecting to find someone in the hallway, but it was empty. The dim, flickering lights cast long shadows on the walls, and the silence was almost suffocating. Then I saw it. The door to room 3 was ajar, the inside completely dark. Curiosity got the best of me, and I walked over, peering into the room. It was empty, but as I stood there, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. There was something wrong with that room. I backed away, feeling a strange sense of dread that I couldn't explain. The next morning I went to check out, hoping to put the eerie experience behind me, but when I got to the lobby, the clerk was gone. The entire place felt deserted, as if no one had been there for years. My key was still in my pocket, and the door to the office was slightly open. Curiosity pulled me forward, and I slipped inside. Behind the counter I found a dusty guest book. Flipping through the pages, I noticed a strange pattern. Several names were crossed out with thick black lines. Next to the entries for rooms 3, 4, and 6, the word left was scribbled hastily in red ink. Just as I was trying to make sense of it, I heard the whispers again, clearer this time, closer. I backed out of the office and quickly made my way to my car, desperate to leave. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the motel one last time. That's when I saw a figure in the window of room 6. It was a shadowy outline, staring right at me, unmoving. I blinked, and it was gone, but the chilling sense of being watched remained. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles down the road. That night, as I tried to sleep in a new town, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a photo attachment with no sender, no message. When I opened it, my heart nearly stopped. It was a picture of room 6, taken from the inside, with the bed neatly made, as if waiting. And at the edge of the bed there was a figure, shadowy, blurred, watching. For years I had heard the local legend about the house on the hill. Perched just outside of town, it was an old, dilapidated mansion that had once been grand but was now a forgotten ruin. Everyone called it the Watcher's House, because people claimed a figure could be seen standing in the window at night, gazing out over the town. I had always dismissed it as a spooky story meant to keep kids from trespassing, but curiosity got the better of me one night. A friend of mine, Adam, convinced me to check it out with him. We were bored, restless, and eager for a thrill. Armed with only a couple of flashlights, we made our way up the winding path, surrounded by the quiet of the night and the distant sounds of the town below. The mansion loomed before us, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. Broken windows, crumbling walls, and vines creeping up the stone gave it an eerie, abandoned beauty. We stood there for a moment, both of us feeling an unspoken sense of dread. But Adam broke the silence, chuckling to shake off the tension. "Come on, let's see if we can find the Watcher," he said, and with that, we made our way inside. The air inside was thick, stale, carrying a faint smell of rot and decay. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating old furniture covered in dust and sheets. Every step we took echoed down the empty hallways, amplifying the silence. As we explored the first floor, it became clear that this was once a magnificent home. Grand chandeliers, intricately carved moldings, and faded paintings hinted at the life that had once filled these rooms. But it was all overshadowed by the creeping sense that we weren't alone. We were about to head upstairs when we heard it, a faint dragging sound coming from the second floor. We stopped, exchanging nervous glances. Adam whispered, "Probably an animal, right?" But even he didn't sound convinced. Our flashlights shook slightly as we crept up the staircase following the sound. At the top of the stairs, we found ourselves in a long hallway lined with closed doors. The sound had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press down on us. I tried to laugh it off, but it came out as a nervous chuckle. Adam glanced at me, his usual bravado replaced by uncertainty. Then we saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a door was slightly ajar. From the crack, a soft, flickering light spilled out, casting shadows that danced on the walls. Adam muttered, Did someone else come here?" We slowly approached the door, and as we got closer, a faint whisper reached our ears. It was a low, murmuring voice, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. I hesitated, but Adam pushed the door open. Inside, the room was empty, save for a single candle burning on the floor. The walls were covered in strange symbols, painted in a dark reddish color that I hoped wasn't what I thought it was. The whispers grew louder, echoing in the room as if they were coming from the walls themselves. Adam's face had gone pale. "Let's get out of here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. As we turned to leave, the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. The candle flickered, and suddenly, the whispering stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Panic set in, and I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no sound came from my mouth. It was as if the house had swallowed our voices. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A shadow, dark and twisted, was stretching across the wall, inching closer to us. It moved unnaturally, like it was crawling along the surface, ignoring the contours of the room. Adam grabbed my arm, his face etched with terror. "We need to leave, now!" We forced the door open and bolted down the hallway. But as we descended the stairs, we realized the house had changed. The hallway seemed longer, the rooms unfamiliar. Every turn we took led us back to that same candlelit room where the shadow waited, watching. Hours seemed to pass as we tried to escape, but the house twisted around us, trapping us in a nightmarish loop. Exhausted and terrified, we eventually found ourselves back at the front door. We burst outside, breathing in the cool night air as if we'd been underwater. But the terror didn't end there. As we stood outside, catching our breath, I glanced up at the window on the second floor, the one where the watcher was supposed to appear. There, in the darkness, I saw a figure. It was tall, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Its mouth twisted into a grim smile as it raised a hand, waving slowly. I backed away, pulling Adam with me, and we ran down the hill without looking back. We didn't stop until we were back in town, and neither of us spoke about what we'd seen. The next morning, I went back to the hill alone, hoping to make sense of what had happened. But when I got there, the mansion was gone. There was nothing but an overgrown field, as if the house had never existed. Confused, I asked around town, but everyone claimed there had never been a house on the hill. They said it was just an empty field, untouched for decades. Days later, I received a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of the mansion, taken from outside, with two figures standing in the doorway, Adam and me. I'd always been a fan of horror stories on Reddit. Something about the mix of mystery and anonymity made the stories feel real, even if I knew most were just fiction. One night I stumbled across a thread titled, "The Countdown, When Will You Die?" It sounded silly, like one of those joke posts, but curiosity got the better of me. I clicked on the thread and was surprised by what I saw. The post wasn't long. It simply read, "Type your birth date below, and I'll tell you exactly how much time you have left." Most of the comments were just people joking around, but others seemed genuinely unsettled. A few users claimed the thread had given them predictions that lined up with real-life events, down to the minute. Against my better judgment, I typed my birth date in the comments section. A few minutes passed without any response. I started to feel foolish, thinking I'd wasted my time, until I received a reply. You have 237 days left. For a second I stared at the comment, not really processing what I was reading. It seemed oddly specific. I refreshed the page, thinking the comment would disappear, but it stayed there, haunting me with those numbers. 237 days. I laughed it off, telling myself it was just some troll trying to scare people. But deep down, the words stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow this random prediction had wormed its way into my mind. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. I began seeing the number 237 everywhere. The time would be 2:37 whenever I looked at the clock, or I'd pay $2.37 at the store without realizing it. Once I checked my phone's battery, and it was at 23%, with 7 hours left until it would die. The coincidences were piling up, and each time I saw that number, it felt like a ticking clock counting down the days. Finally, I decided to revisit the thread to see if I could find any clues. But when I searched for it, it was gone. The entire thread had been deleted without a trace. I checked my comment history to see if I could find the original reply, but even that was missing. It was as if the thread had never existed. I tried to move on, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But as the days passed, I found myself constantly thinking about that number. 237 days. I started marking the days on my calendar, counting down to the exact date. It felt irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was waiting for me. On day 200, the dreams began. Each night, I'd dream of dark hallways stretching endlessly, with a soft ticking echoing in the background, like a clock counting down. I'd see shadows moving in the distance, and every time I tried to get closer, they'd vanish, leaving only the ticking behind. One night, as I was drifting off, I heard a faint whisper in the silence of my room. Almost time. I shot up, heart pounding, but my room was empty. I couldn't sleep after that, too terrified of what I might hear or see next. The days continued to pass, each one bringing me closer to the deadline. By now, I was convinced the prediction was real, that something or someone had marked me. My friends noticed my change in behavior. They asked why I was so jumpy, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them. How could I explain that a random comment on Reddit had convinced me I was running out of time? As I reached day 236, the fear became overwhelming. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I stayed up all night, waiting, heart pounding, as if something would happen the moment the countdown reached 0. And then, on day 237, I received a message. It was from an unknown account on Reddit with a name that looked like a jumble of random letters and numbers. The message was simple. It's time. I stared at the screen, feeling like the walls were closing in. My hands shook as I tried to respond, to ask who they were, but before I could hit send, the account disappeared. It was as if it had never existed, leaving only that haunting message. I sat there, too scared to move as the hours ticked by. Midnight came and went, and nothing happened. I was alive, unharmed. For the first time in weeks, I took a deep breath, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe it really had all been in my head. But as I stood up to head to bed, I noticed something strange. My phone screen had turned on by itself, and on it was a notification I'd never seen before. Last chance, type yes to continue. I stared at it, my finger hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to type yes, just to see what would happen. But a stronger, more terrified part of me knew that whatever this was, it wasn't normal. I put my phone down, refusing to touch it. The next morning, the notification was gone, but the sense of dread remained. It's been a few months since then, and I haven't received any more messages. The countdown ended, but the feeling of being watched never truly went away. Even now, sometimes late at night, I'll get the urge to check my phone, to see if there's a new message waiting for me. I haven't given in, not yet, but I know it's only a matter of time. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. I hope you found some peace and comfort. Before you drift off completely, let me know in the comments what time it is, where you are, and which country you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. Until next time, rest well and sweet dreams.